Call the meeting to order for the City of Saratoga Springs, Tuesday, February 21st, 2023 at 6:01 PM. Present tonight, I have Councilman McComber, Councilman Wilden, and Councilman Carn. So we do have a quorum. I've got Councilman Wilden leading us in our invocation, and Councilman McComber in our Pledge of Allegiance.
Our Father in heaven, we're grateful that we're able to be gathered here together this evening to plan for the success of our city, and we're grateful for all those things that are being brought forth to us. And we're grateful for the many wonderful people that we have that live within the boundaries of our city, and we ask Thee to bless them and us, that we'll be able to continue to make this a better place for all of us to live. And these things we say in the name of Thy Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Will the audience please rise and join me in repeating the Pledge of Allegiance? I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you.
Okay, public input. Time has been set aside for the public to express ideas, concerns, and comments for subject matter not listed on the agenda. Please avoid repetitive comments. Please limit your comments to 3 minutes. Please be respectful in your comments. If you're here for the public hearing tonight, please hold your comments for the public hearing. Is anybody here for an item not on the agenda?
Public hearing agenda.
Public hearing. Okay. I will close the public hearing at this public input. Do we have anything sent in, Owen? Okay. Reports from the council? Okay. Oh. Councilman Carn?
Just that the 30-day comment period is just opening on the concept management plan for the Utah Lake Authority. And that will go from the February 20th for the next 30 days.
Okay. Perfect. Okay, Mark, administration?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. One thing that's kind of unique, we will be doing our open meetings training here in just a little bit. I just wanted to point out, you notice how we have our public comment period. That is going to be required if everything goes the way it's planning through the legislative session. There's a bill that will require every public meeting to have a public comment period like the one we just had. And so we do it by a matter of practice, but Planning Commission and any other public meeting would follow that same trend going forward. And that's one of the two bills that Kevin was probably going to talk about in our open meetings, but just wanted to point that out. Legislative session, thankfully, will be over next Friday. It's been kind of crazy. There's hundreds of bills out there. A lot of bills that we are seeing happen that, for example, the land use bill, we anticipate all of the things that we've kind of been talking about throughout the session, leading up to the session. It will have probably the full 2-week turnaround time period. Now, there's good and bad with that. It's bad for, we have 2 weeks or 14 business days to turn that around. The good news is that if it's an incomplete packet or if they don't address all of our red lines, we don't start that next 14-day period of review for us. So if there's anything that gets missed, we push it back to the developer and say, nope, you're not out of round one. And so our clock doesn't start until they've got everything completed and addressed all of those concerns. And so frankly, it should go both ways as far as us being able to say, no, we're not going to accept that. You haven't met the comments that you've previously been given. So it will have, kind of both edges to that knife. But the last round will have 20 days to review it, but we're going to be limited to four rounds of reviews on those things. However, the one thing that is very important is that will only be for administrative decisions. So anything that is still a legislative decision, that time clock, that shot clock does not impact that. So we still have some flexibility with that. How we work within like the planned community zone and things of that nature, because some of those are still legislative versus administrative, we're going to have to work through that. We basically will have about a year till February of next year to get all of the code changes that we need to in place so that we can handle that. But we're definitely going to need to ramp up and make sure that we're hitting those review dates and things of that nature. There's a lot of nuances with that. One of the things is it's going to change the asphalt standard to the minimum asphalt or the maximum asphalt that a city could require would be 32 feet. We're at 29 feet of pavement width, but then we've got our concrete storm drain curb gutter, which gets us to 32. Theoretically, we could go up to the 32 once this passes. It would be a concept for us to consider, given the internal accessory dwelling units and other things, but we have time to implement those changes. So, fundamentally, there's going to be a lot of changes with that, and there's a lot of other bills out there. We have not seen the PID lid bill this year, but we're told that it's still coming, and we're not quite sure what's going to happen with that. But it'll be crazy the next 2 weeks.
Quick question for you, if I may, Mayor.
Yep.
So with the impact, like for the permits, like the 14-day turnaround and their applications and things, we have a lot of applications that come in that say can comply, will comply. Are we able to reject them without that if they're not complying?
So again, anything that you're still seeing is a legislative decision, and it's still at that legislative phase. Once, for example, things get approved at your level, and then it's merely the construction drawings and the more administrative type stuff, that administrative stuff will be forced to delegate that, even away from the planning commission, that will be forced to be delegated down to staff level.
And
that's one
then
of the changes.
are we able to increase impact fees because of the new people we're going to have to hire to meet that standard?
It wouldn't be impact fees, but we definitely can amend our fees to cover the cost of development. So that's certainly something that we can consider. We're right now working on updating, our fees anyway, so.
Sounds good. Thank you, Mayor.
Okay, Councilman Carn?
Yeah, Mark, can you give it just an example of a meeting where we don't have public comment?
For example, interestingly enough, I just mentioned that administrative decisions that would be forced down to staff level, that may actually now trigger where staff, for the planning department and our DRC meetings, that may now become a public meeting where we have to record it, take minutes, take notes, and allow for public comment. And so there are still some kind of gray areas with the code as to whether it will actually bring that in. But again, that's the kind of level of what's changing at the legislature. What they're trying to do is force municipalities and counties to get done with the development process as quickly as possible, because if we can get through the processes faster, then of course it will result in affordable housing. And so the thought is that if we can, speed those times up, it will remove the bottlenecks and things of that nature. And so that's the thought process. But by stripping away even some of the things that you've delegated to the planning commission at this point, final site plan reviews and stuff, those things will be delegated down to staff. And we're going to have to kind of make sure that we make all of the adjustments per the state requirements of LUDMA.
Okay,
You were asking about the bill that requires the public comment portion, right? Is that what you're referring to, the public
like I
comment?
just, what,
Library board is probably our only public meeting that we don't have an actual public comment portion. And interestingly, the bill actually does not apply to the planning commission. It specifically excludes them from at least the current draft of it.
so my other comment here, in the spirit of affordable housing, I'm all in favor of meeting the state standard on road width. Going forward, I'd love to see that change. It should make our housing more affordable.
There are some fiscal impacts we're going to want to take a look at as well, because it would be increasing that asphalt width by 10%, but to meet the other parking requirements that might be.
We're coming into a whole new world with mandated IEDUs, so.
Yeah.
Couldn't agree more. I drove through North Shore. You couldn't drive through it. North Shore, you couldn't drive through it.
No, yeah.
Literally was stopping, waiting, and then I'd have to hurry and get around the car. It literally took me, to go a quarter mile, it took me almost 7 minutes.
If we're forced to allow for these things, our roads need to be wider.
And again, those are all things that luckily we'll have about a year to try. And again, it's still in the process. It will need to get, adopted by both bodies, signed by the governor, things.
We're in favor of looking at it.
You bet. Well, as soon as we've got it enrolled, then we'll be working on those amendments. That's all I had, Mayor. Thank you very much.
Mayor, the Utah Lake Authority, there's a cleanup bill that's been numbered now. It looks like it'll probably go through.
It's just funding.
It's not funding, it's changing some of the, how the seats on the board are constituted, but it doesn't really have an effect on us.
Okay, perfect. Councilman Wilden?
Somewhat related to all this, I'd just like to say, Mark, thank you for representing us so well at the league. I think as a city, we punch well above our weight. I go to those meetings, but punching above our weight has nothing to do with me. It's all Mark. He's heavily involved. And if you go to those meetings, how reliant I think the overall state is on Mark. So thank you for trying to keep our state legislators sane. Jeff Moss is phenomenal. I'll just stop there, but
Because he was a councilman first.
yes, so thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Okay. Public hearing for the amended storm drain impact fee facilities plan. Jeremy?
Mayor and council, this is the fourth one we've taken to you. This one is one of the smaller ones. I think it was a 7% increase was all. So as we discussed before, this is primarily an update to reflect increased construction prices we've seen in the industry. Happy to answer any questions you may have.
Okay. This is a public hearing, so we'll open it up for public hearing first. Is anybody here for comment on the amended storm drain impact fee facilities plan? Okay. Anything sent in? Okay, I will close the public hearing and turn it to the council. Councilman Wilden?
No questions. I'm just ready to make a motion if the rest are.
Councilman Carn, did you have a,
I'm ready to second.
okay. I'll entertain a motion.
Councilman McComber, you all right?
Yeah, please go for it.
Okay, I'll move that we approve public hearing item number 1 as stated on the agenda, including any staff findings and conditions.
Second.
I have a first from Councilman Wilden, second Councilman Carn. Any further discussion? McComber?
Aye.
Wilden?
Aye.
Carn?
Aye.
Motion passes unanimously. I'll entertain a motion on the consent calendar.
So made.
I have a
Second.
first from Councilman McComber, second Councilman Carn. Any further discussion? Carn?
Aye.
Wilden?
Aye.
McComber?
Aye.
Motion passes unanimously. Business item 1, second quarter financial updates.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. The report that you have is the second quarter of fiscal year 2023, so it goes through December 31st. And if you look at the KRI analysis, you'll see a little bit of red there. We got some shading from some development revenues that are coming less than last year and less than multi-year. But if you also look at that, you look to see that our taxes are coming in significantly higher than what we determined at the time compared to last year and then also with multi-year. We adjusted our budgets in January for those changes that we noticed in this trend of this fiscal year. So that's already been. So I was just seeing if you have any questions concerning this quarterly report.
Councilman Wilden?
I just say I appreciate staff is always budgeting conservatively on the revenue and the expenditure side. So even though there's a significant drop in development fees, which is expected, we're still a very fiscally strong city. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Councilman McComber?
Sort of wanted to maybe piggyback on that and echo, I've been here long enough that I remember when we were one-legged in our revenues and we weren't offset with sales tax revenues or other revenues. And when there was the recession that happened in the mid-2010s, right? It was devastating to the city, and there was a need for a huge property tax increase. And because of the conservative nature, to piggyback on what Stephen was saying, and the fact that we are doing the right things to help develop the city, not only are we able to mitigate this, you're able to adjust very quickly in January, where I think it was like 8 months last when we had this situation, you know what I mean, like years ago. It took so long to mitigate it, you're mitigating it immediately. But then also, so importantly, we still, in the last decade or so, we've reduced property taxes 3 times. And so we're trying to get things all in balance. So thank you very much and appreciate all the hard work you do and all the great awards you get for your financial accounting. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have business item 2, resolution formally initiating proceedings under the pending ordinance doctrine of Utah Code. Okay.
Okay, Mayor and Council, we are. Yeah.
We are bringing forward this pending ordinance based on some determined needs for adjusting our parking requirements in the parking ordinances. Looking at several things as we've done our planning reviews, we've determined these proposed changes. So in required parking for off-street parking, this first amendment that we're proposing is for all newly constructed buildings and buildings, uses, and lots that are legally expanded, modified, or require a change of use permit. So that's just talking about what all these changes or all these requirements will be effective to these particular uses. And then we have determined a need to look at the location of parking areas so that customers can more easily access the businesses that they have, applying one standard across the board for large buildings versus smaller buildings, sometimes in parking lots can create havoc or difficulties. So we have proposed this change, and I'll just read through it quickly. Location of parking areas, required off-street parking stalls for non-residential uses shall be placed within walking distance to the nearest customer to the nearest customer entrances from the correlating non-residential use and individual tenant space as outlined in the table below. The next sentence refers to residential, so we'll skip that. But the non-residential use and individual tenant space, we've broken that down into size of buildings or tenant spaces and what the walking distance, the maximum walking distance should be for accessing those businesses or buildings. So depending on size.
So I have a quick question. I think it might be better just to do the questions as we go than having to come back. So with the non-residential use, so this doesn't apply to HOAs that have a clubhouse. That's considered a residential use?
Yes, that's a
Thank you.
I have no further presentation, so if you have questions, I think it's a fairly simple change, but I think it'll tie up some concerns that we have.
Ken, really quick, for example, in the Sportsman's Warehouse parking lot, you got Five Below, Deseret Book. If a smaller space is used at 200 feet, but it's close to Sportsman's Warehouse entrance, those stalls cannot be double counted, correct?
Well, it depends on if there's a joint parking agreement in the area, so there could be some overlap there. But the overall intention is that these parking stalls that are required for that small space, you know, let's say it's a 5,000 square foot space, then they will need to have parking stalls within 200 feet that are assigned to them.
That's not happening.
Okay.
It's going to be tricky to enforce that.
Councilman Carn?
Yeah, my only question, I talked to Mark about this earlier in the day. Has there been any changes since we spoke, Mark, to what we're seeing here? No. Okay. We talked about maybe a small tweak to some of the language, but if we didn't, then I'm comfortable here.
There's another table as we get further and further into parking. We're going to need to adjust the parking table, which is a different section.
Okay.
And so we'll make tweaks to that, and we'll bring that back to you at some point.
If there's no other questions, I will entertain a motion.
I move to approve business item 2, resolution formally initiating proceedings under the pending ordinance doctrine in Utah Code Section 10-9A-509 and City Code Section 19.02.02 to amend the off-street parking requirements ordinance in the City Code Sections 19.04.02 and 19.04.03, Resolution R 23-9, dated today with any findings and conditions in the staff report.
I'll second.
Okay, I have a first from Councilman Carn, a second from Councilman McComber. Any further comments?
Can you read that again?
Nope.
I missed that one.
I wasn't listening. I got lost in how long that motion was. So.
It's on the record.
Councilman Wilden?
Aye.
Oh, in the mic.
Aye.
Councilman Carn?
Aye.
Councilman McComber?
Aye.
Motion passes unanimously. Thank you for preparing that. Do we have need for closed session after the work session tonight, Mark?
If we could, briefly.
Okay, perfect. We will go into a work session. Item 1, Patriot Park, Phase 3.
Mayor, does that close the policy session then technically?
Yeah,
Yes.
Okay, I just want to make sure I'm following along here.
but we can go back into it, so you wait till the very end. in
Okay.
case something comes-
Okay.
That's what we've always done.
Yeah. Okay, who's got Patriot Park?
Is this Lars?
Oh, we thought Jeremy was just late to the meeting again.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and council members. Do you have that available to put up on the screen? Or do you?
We should.
Yeah, I sent it out. It-
So real quickly, while we're pulling that up, we've invited Lars to come and just do kind of a quick planning discussion. He's come up with just a real brief concept for us to consider. And what we really wanted to do is get the feedback from the council and get whatever feedback you've got for the things that you'd like us to include as we move forward with this Phase 3 of Patriot Park design. As you know, Phase 1, we built the ball fields. Phase 2, we acquired the rest of the property and we finished the purchase. We've got the police station that's been built there. Excuse me, and we've got some, some long-term plans. We've only shown some concepts of everything that's north of the existing ball fields. And so what we wanted to do was get some feedback from you all. Have you, whatever ideas you've got, we want to have Lars with those ideas in hand so that he can start working on a concept design that works. Again, it's still very preliminary, but again, from a planning standpoint, for us to be able to, work on programming, I know Heston's here. Obviously, he's got some concerns about needing some more multi-field space and soccer space, things of that nature. So again, we're not sure what the layout's going to ultimately end up landing to be, but we did want to get some feedback from the council before we start going too in-depth as far as planning goes. So Lars, we'll kick it over to you. You've got the concept plan in your packet, as well as we've got some concept plans up for the audience as well.
Yeah, so of course, you're already familiar with what you have in the first phase, so I won't dive into that. In this third phase, what we're showing is basically some low-hanging fruit. The fields, Heston mentioned he wanted a fourplex this time instead of the sixplex, and he wanted 2 of the fields to be for high school baseball, and then 2 softball fields. So I threw in some easy.
Lars, just really quick, Heston, can we have you come sit at the hot seat in case there's questions?
As long as Heston remembers he can't spend any money.
Okay.
So we threw some pickleball courts in there. The pickleball courts that are in phase 1 are extremely popular, so we added some to that. And then, of course, parking around the perimeter. There is a small water park, playground, things like that. So this is just the real basic kind of the programming that your Parks Department and Rec Department gave me in advance. And now we're here to hear what you would like to include. So anything is changeable here. Don't look at this as, it's just the base
To
plan.
get the story started.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so first of all, I'm happy to be part of any subcommittee or small group to work with Lars or anybody else on this concept. Okay, some questions I have. The pickleball courts, are half of those tennis courts?
Right now, they're just all pickleball courts.
Okay, so a lot of the feedback I've heard from pickleball players is you've got us staring directly into the sun on our current court, so we got to make sure we adjust directionality on these courts so they're not doing that.
Yeah, they're north-south on this plan.
Yeah, so,
But sometime of the year, you're always going to look into the sun,
Well,
because the
but-
sun goes like this.
When you're
yes,
north-south, it limits that to the smallest that it can be.
right,
Yeah.
right. I personally would like, and I understand the beautiful parks, but I would like to mitigate the amount of just space that we're maintaining and mowing and everything, and utilize the park for programming. I would like to have 2 of our multi-purpose fields have geothermal underneath them and have them be lit with turf, so we can program nighttime on those fields.
So artificial turf
Yes.
on 2 of the fields.
Yep,
Okay.
yep. I've got friends whose kids play outdoor soccer for clubs in January. My friend's son played a game in Lehigh. It was 13 degrees at game time on concrete, basically.
Frozen.
And if we have artificial turf, that's something we can program towards, and geothermal. You know, in my head, I even think about bubbling fields and, you know, utilizing them year-round.
And the location here is close to the geothermal. too.
It's
So
right
with
next to
it-
the geothermal that we,
Find it
that we have
well.
already proven, right? So we know it's there and it works. I absolutely 100% would love to see a large pavilion at this park. Something, you know, to the scale of what maybe Ogden has at their complex. You know what I'm talking about? That could have an enclosed seating area for ticketed events, but also have open to the background to the multi-purpose field. So if you think about concerts at Splash Days, where we can get a lot of people into that venue with fireworks behind it.
So you're saying similar to an amphitheater?
Yes.
I'm actually thinking an amphitheater.
An amphitheater, yes. Yeah, not just a stage like we have at Neptune
Because you
Park.
said pavilion, and that makes you
Not
think
pavilion,
full
no,
park.
I'm talking a full amphitheater with
You know what we designed down
Stage.
south?
Yeah.
backstage
We're actually
facilities. You know, look at what Ogden has at their, I really like what Ogden has at their city complex, if you're familiar with that,
Yeah,
what they have up there.
their downtown area?
Is it's set up to where they can have enclosed seating. They can basically be fenced in, but also be able,
You can have a paid concert.
you could have a paid concert there, but you also have it available to where it's not completely enclosed. So our multi-purpose fields would be behind it. So that, you know, you could get more people into that venue if needed. Now, we also want to be, we would need that stage so that at Neptune Park, when we're sitting at our splash days, everyone's looking at the stage looking directly at the setting sun.
Yeah.
We need to flip that, right? The performers could maybe, we need to make it so that the crowd is not looking directly at the setting sun.
But you could put an
during a
overhang
concert.
for the performers. You can help
You could put an overhang for the performers, something. But I think having that stage backing the lake, so people are looking at the stage with the mountains and the lake, that's a
The
much more
fireworks.
picturesque, and fireworks, that's a much more picturesque setting. So I called it a retention pond, but that area to the east where it's all brown, I don't know how, if the space works to flip the ballparks to the west and multipurpose fields and stage to the east on this concept. And again, you know, talking to Heston before the meeting, I think we've got a really great need for multipurpose fields. I'd even be willing to sacrifice, if we had to, a couple of ball fields for more multipurpose if we made it work right.
I actually think if you really look over where City Hall is going to be, there would be a lot of room there, and you could actually take advantage of some of the wetland area. I mean, you could
Yeah.
make it work. I
Yeah.
agree. I think having it, the one we designed down south, the whole thought is maybe just we move it here because this is where we have the parking, this is where we have all of the, you know, splash days and everything. So just to piggyback, I just wanted to piggyback on your comment.
So just to add to that, you remember when we designed that performance park, it was a full-on stage with lighting and seating with the grass area behind it, and people have to rent their chairs, and that's what you're envisioning.
I think for long term, I mean, we're coming up on 55,000 people here, so I think that we're
Yeah,
I like
do
it.
it.
I like
you
it.
know, having that concept, but down here, that is leveraged, you know, our library and city hall are gonna be here, so we could leverage that stage facility for library programming.
Well, and
There's a
then we-
lot of things we can use that facility for.
And we had huge sails, the big poles that were holding the lights, they used sails to shade the crowd too a little bit, even from just the sun during the
Yeah.
day, like if you have a concert during the day.
Yep.
So there's some real great options. I think that, you know, tying it in with, because you don't have in here into this plan, we do definitely need to have City Hall and the library designed into here. Sorry, Chris, go ahead.
No, you're fine. I mean, Neptune Park is a great facility. It's 10 acres. This is 40 acres?
100
But this piece,
Oh, yeah, this piece is 45 acres.
38, I think, or something like that.
Yeah, the residual parcel that we bought was 45 acres.
Yeah, so we need this to future plan for our city gatherings.
This is
And I know
Central Park.
Heston, I know Recreation doesn't want to hear it, but these fields are gonna be used also for city gatherings.
Yep.
And we, you know, we get one chance at laying it out the right way. And I just think that, you know, Ogden has done a great job.
That's great.
With their city complex, and we should look at what they've done and improve on it.
I like
I
it.
think it would be worth going and taking a trip up there. I'd like to go, and I've never been there. I've seen pictures,
Yeah,
I've seen aerials.
let's go take a road
But you know
trip.
what I mean? I think that would be definitely a value to go and take a look at.
Because I think we've got the space there, and again, and I really like the ideas of the geothermal on a couple of
I
the
do too.
fields. And even if we could space those a little bit differently, where you could put some
Bleachers.
bleachers along those fields, you know, just to, so you've got, like, just for example, 4 fields that are regularly programmed, and then you've got 2 competition fields. You know, for.
Full size.
And you can, well, they all can be full size, but the 2 competition fields, you could absolutely program those differently, and there's a different customer who will use those.
So on those multipurpose fields, are we thinking some lighting on some of them?
Yeah, I'd like to see 2 of them with turf geothermal lit.
Okay.
In my, I mean,
I
no,
think.
I'm spending money I don't have, right? I'm just, this is,
Well-
conceptually, this is what I'd like to see.
Yeah, I think definitely on 2, but really you actually could then have the poles that go between the 2. They could shoot some light on the other 2.
Sure.
It might not be regulation lighting, but enough to have a practice or to play on.
Yeah.
So, I mean, really you'd end up lighting 4 fields.
Well, and if we're programming the baseball fields until 10 or 11 on a weekend, there's no reason why we can't program soccer fields till 10.
When we can go till midnight, because we wrote it on everyone's plots over here. that they
So
have.
those things could
Keston
be,
doesn't want to go to midnight.
I get yelled at if we go too late.
Well, you can get yelled at, but every single one of the plots in this vicinity has it on their titles.
their deed,
On the
yeah.
title and their deed, midnight. And we did that because we knew there would be a problem.
Don't you get yelled at anyway?
But you know,
Yeah.
especially those competition fields,
You know
they'll
what?
be
Maybe,
used.
maybe we need to send, maybe we need to do a little mailer to that neighborhood again before in the spring of each year. Let's send a mailer, reminder, your plot, midnight, okay. I think that's something that Annalisa can help with. Yeah. Sorry, Chris, keep going.
No, a couple of other things, I saw in here. I don't care if this area has a splash pad. I'd rather see the splash pad moved to the other side of Redwood Road where
No,
we.
not Redwood Road.
I'm sorry, Saratoga Road.
Yeah.
Where we potentially were talking about a one-day aquatics area
Yep.
for the city. Even if it was developed along with this conceptually, but I'd rather see it over there than taking up this park space here. And then again, pushing out, I'm in favor of getting rid of some of the just nice green areas between
You gotta
back
have,
of ball fields and parking areas. Just
you gotta have a little bit of.
a little bit, but all that area we have to maintain and cut. And I understand you want to have a nice looking park. I get all that.
Right, and you have to have that buffer for
Sure,
balls.
sure. But I want to maximize the space.
Yeah, no, I
So
agree.
that means, you know, if we can reduce it and get 6 more pickleball courts somewhere or, you know, something, I want to maximize that.
So there's actually a bill up at the legislature this year that is probably going to be pushing pretty hard on turf, limiting turf where it's not, you know, playable surfaces and it's not active recreation areas. And so to your point, Michael, we do definitely have some of that stuff that's going to act as buffer between, say, the back of a baseball field and parking lots and stuff.
But you can use rocks and bushes.
Yeah, but we definitely are going to need to do that. One thing that Councilmember Porter mentioned to me earlier today when I was meeting with him, he indicated a desire he indicated a desire to do some sort of plantings and things with names and stuff for water conservation, garden kind of a concept in this. So have like a little area where we're using that as an education platform for, you know, good water-wise landscaping and things of that nature. And so he had mentioned that, and perhaps that's something we could program in. It's really just what we're going to be doing anyway, to your
Yeah.
point, but adding some information placards and things of that nature.
So a couple other things I was thinking of, and depending on how we flip this around with a, you know, an official stage, what do we call it? Not a pavilion, but
Amphitheater.
an amphitheater. Yeah, with an amphitheater is, and I know there are some cities around us that have done this, but having an ice ribbon in the wintertime, I think would be really cool to have.
Well, you're making a natural ice ribbon. You can see the big one right there. You can make it a little smaller.
Yeah, so it just depends on where we fit it in. But I think that would be a really cool concept here.
They're money makers too. Harriman makes money on theirs.
Okay. I think I had a couple more, but you guys go ahead and I might jump back in.
You want to go or you?
That's enough for me. I mean,
So I definitely concur. I piggybacked on some of the things so that we didn't have to have a repeat. I think you understand why I'm supporting that. So I agree on the pickleball courts. One of the things, areas that I feel is really wasted is in the current Phase 1, the fourth box there, you've got the pickleball courts and the playground, and then you have a really just sort of a wasted space that's never really used. I would rather either put in a permanent 9-square, do something to make that more usable. I don't know if it's worth going in and having to do pickleball courts, because I know there's some sprinkler system boxes. I noticed, I walked through there. But could we just make it improved with like a 9-square, like a metal, yeah?
I would just say that during the season, that's used quite a bit for warm-up. We have teams warm up in that area. There's no large grass space
Oh, yeah.
Oh, for baseball?
for baseball.
That was the
So then
intent.
a 9-square would work because you could work around that. That's like a nine, it's because it's just poles and things. So we wouldn't want to then take away that grass. I get that. For me, I'm absolutely in fan of moving the water park over to the east side because one, I'd like to program that, leave space for in 10 years when maybe there is a rec center that's voted on so that we have a space here because it makes sense. But then also have some of the things that people really did want. They didn't want to pay for the huge price point of the rec center, but they loved the idea of soaking pools, different things for hot springs. Because we are Saratoga Springs, Splash Days never had water until Jim and I got in. We finally were like, we need to have something that, that has some water involved because Splash Days and stuff. But just moving that over there. My other reason why is because I would hate to have a water apparatus where parents aren't watching their kids because they're watching their kids play ball. And that's not a babysitting facility that I want, that liability. I want that where you can't watch baseball at the same time. So for me, it's way more a liability issue than it is, having it located. Having another playground, yes. But know that that playground will not be supervised very well. It's, hey kids, you were bugging me, go play. I want to watch your big brother or sister play softball, baseball. Also, I think that it is going to be a tricky design as you work through where City Hall is, because I do think the amphitheater needs to sort of be right in there by City Hall like Ogden's is, like I saw in the pictures. So that's going to definitely take some creativity, and I know you have it in you, so you'll be able to help us figure it out. Question is maybe for Jeremy, Mark, the squiggly brown area, is that non-developable? Is that wetlands? What is that light brown squiggly?
We're good.
I think you're talking east of the.
East of the baseball
I
field.
called the retention today, but that's,
Yeah, that's what
It's a wet, can we
that.
put grass in there and allow?
Delineated wetland, it does, so yeah, we'll work on.
I just would love to again, maximize space. I would love to, even if that has to be a detention basin, well, let's grass it and let kids practice
Pickleball.
soccer or put some more pickleball, whatever.
To me, that's a great space for the amphitheater. Because across the street is also going to be commercial.
It's a potential wetland area. We need to delineate it and determine what it is. There's a lot of changes that have occurred as that property is changed from agriculture. It may no longer be a wetland area. And even if it is potentially, there's ways to mitigate that, provide a bank and do whatever we want with that. So it's not off limits.
Great. Let's go ahead.
I was just say, so Heston, last time we were talking, you're running out of space for baseball, so if we have 10, we do need the 4 fields and the 6 fields, so you're saying put the amphitheater into that detention basin spot.
I think on that corner of Pony and Saratoga Road, if the amphitheater
It's-
backed to that.
It's a real problem because parking's way far away. You're now going to increase the amount of parking
Can we
costs.
reconfigure it somewhere?
Well, parking's already, all of the police station area, all that parking, you've got all the parking backing in behind the baseball fields. Like, where that big rectangle is where really the amphitheater, because I went into City Hall and we looked at this, then the little rectangle, the little square above it, so you've got that weird shape, right? So you've got the big rectangle that backs onto the current Patriot Park. That could be that whole amphitheater and park area. That's enormous. You're gonna fit 12 to 15,000 people with that expanded area. And then you've got the smaller square fits City Hall and the library.
Is
So
is
if-
that intersection future signalized?
Yes, it is. Now, if I could, again, remember, this is purely concept.
Sure.
We have a brilliant problem-solving individual here that
course.
can make all these things fit and work. I think there's some central themes that I'm hearing, Lars, and that is, let's tighten things up. Let's use this place as efficiently as possible. I personally think that the parking that's showing on the west side should really be in between the two ball fields and between there so that it's a more shared use for those kinds of areas. I think that there's a lot of ways that we can be very creative and use this land incredibly efficiently, and at the same time, get the maximum benefit with maybe even some smaller fields, some smaller soccer fields for, the younger.
No pressure, Lars. You set the bar high when other cities copied Patriot Park.
Yeah, that's
We're
true.
expecting at least that.
Well, copying is the best form of flattery. And
is.
and the one other theme, Mark, is I think Chris and I saw Steven nodding his head, and Jim, let's include the east side of Saratoga Road in this design concept, like just to have a general idea.
Inlet Park you're talking about.
But park, yeah.
And not designing a rec center because we're not putting one in, but we have to leave a space for that. And I just like to have that kind of, again, long-term planning. If we lose that spot, then it's like a waste long-term.
So for Lars, we've got the North Marina dredging project, which is bringing some material onto this site. So we
Yep.
need to be working on balancing the site, but we're not going construction level drawings. We're going to keep bringing you some concepts
Concepts,
to buy
yeah.
off on it. And then we're probably going to have to discuss how do we phase this, because this is a lot of acreage. This is a very large park, and so we're going to have to kind of work on some phasing of that. But we'll have Lars take these comments, and if there's anything else that you think
Well,
of.
And the RAP tax
Get
didn't
into
pass.
Phasing, it'd be good to hear engineering-wise, but also with Heston, if we're putting other parks in that are getting you your multi-purpose, are the 4 ball diamonds first? What's Rec's prioritization with everything else we've got going on in the city and other parks?
So if we take our field sports like soccer and things like those programs, we're already capping where we're at with the city. Baseball, we're also capping where we're at right now. So we need both of them. The trends are right now, baseball, we are capped, but it's not growing as strongly as soccer is. Multi-purpose fields, we need them both.
Well, what I'm saying is if we've got 3 of them coming in this development and another one in this development, and we've got money to do one, if those are coming in for multi-purpose you can program, do we do baseball first, or do you need them in this spot first?
Well, and there's also, if we move the amphitheater from down south, now you can put, because there's 2 baseball fields down there, now we can maybe get 4 in there, you know what I mean? Because we just need to keep the holistic picture for you.
Just looking citywide at what
Yeah.
your needs are, not just this park.
A couple small comments. On the amphitheater, you'll have to forgive me if I don't place it up in that corner because I'm concerned with the traffic noise from Pony Express. Are you also concerned with that noise?
That's why I was saying it needs to go down next to the police
A
and
little further south
Yeah.
from there, okay.
It's a great point.
the parking issue.
And the parking issue, okay.
Because people will park on Pony.
Another thing that I want to leave space for, and I know this was frowned on in the past, I'm in favor of it. I think we should have a donors area of the park. So either a wall, people can buy a brick with their name on it, Karn family, we're platinum sponsors of the park. It's either on a wall or on a ground, right? But I'm all for letting people donate and become vested.
We can incorporate that. A couple thoughts on that. Ogden does have their sponsor on the stage right above
They
the
have a corporate
stage.
sponsor,
All the way at the
yes.
top, yes.
Yep, yeah, and I'm talking about, like when the library opened, we had Friends of the Library, and their name's on a plaque in the library, and they donated money. I'm all for opening up, letting people donate, have donation levels at the park.
Yeah.
Having an area that recognizes those. At the first phase of Patriot Park, we've got the Veterans Wall, and that's awesome. I love that. And I think, for people who have been here for a while and they plan on being here for a long time, I think being able to donate to the park and having, leaving a piece of your family there is great. I think people will do it. I've seen it done in my hometown growing up. I've seen it done in other cities, and I think people will participate.
Chris, we did look into it even at Patriot Park, and it was so cost prohibitive. We actually lost,
No value in
we
it?
lost money. It actually cost, we had to charge we were thinking of like a brick, and actually it was gonna cost like $600. What? It was insane because of the Yeah, it was just not, because you have to put them in.
How would other
You have to
people
come
do
in
it?
and take them out and then mark them and put them in. And then if you try and do
Other
it ahead
people
of
do it.
time, it was horrendously annoying. And that's why we ended up just doing the memorial, because that wasn't as cost prohibitive. But yeah, it was definitely frustrating. I'm more of a fan of letting people sponsor, like businesses, getting businesses
Yeah, I'm
involved in
all
our parks.
for, you know, we talked about this in the past,
Yeah,
at the
yeah.
original Patriot Park. I'm all for,
Let's
you know,
get
letting
some,
people sponsor and get some corporate partnerships that help fund these programs.
And even banners on the back fences and stuff, like, come on.
Yeah.
We're not yuppie town.
For the purposes of tonight, that is so weed level, you guys, we're.
But the thing is we've wanted to get that point across for a while. I've been asking for sponsoring on the parks for 3 years, and it hasn't happened, and Chris has too. So I think that's
bet.
why we brought it up again today.
Absolutely, and we can certainly proceed with that. Again, for tonight, though, it's high level. What do you want Lars to bring back in the next conference?
I think he's got some good ideas.
I think a lot of these ideas are great, but coming from the finance guy, what I don't want to see, it was a fantastic plan years ago, but I remember seeing we were going to build our own island and have a Ferris wheel and a go-kart and, you know, something that obviously we're never going to do. And I'm not suggesting any of this is in there, so I, you know, just kind of taper expectations. We're not going to have $100 million park. I'm not saying that's what we're suggesting here, but just no Ferris wheels.
I only want a
and
98
go-kart rings,
Well, and again, to
patches of the mayor.
also help set expectations. If you remember earlier this year, we lent the parks impact fee fund money to finish the acquisition of Patriot Park. So right now, it's a couple $1 million in the deficit. And so we don't have cash to begin any of this construction, but we did want to get concept plans built so that while we're grading, while we have these other projects that can bring materials into the site, we can start putting it where it makes the most sense and start to get the contours of the park the way that we're going to ultimately want it to be. But again, it's efficient for us to be doing this planning and starting that planning.
Having a rough conceptual design is a good thing to have at places like Splash Days in the city tent, to say, here's an example of what we want to do, and a wrap tax can help fund this type of thing. And a wrap tax means this much on.
1 penny per $10.
Right, 1 penny on $10. You know, so just having the drawings at different city events, I think is a good tool. So, you know, having a concept that even if the concept is grand, it's a good tool to have.
Yeah. Speaking of the dirt we're moving with what's come out, how many cubic yards of dirt have we dredged out of that?
90,000, we will have 90,000.
90,000?
Yes, an average. 12 feet.
Average 12 feet deep, okay.
It'll be the only place that
And then,
They're about half done.
Lars, you had mentioned a quick update on some grant funding.
Yes.
Is this, oh wait, there's more?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some steak knives are going to get thrown in.
So we covered our existing grant applications and pending applications at our retreat. Since that time, there's been well, I think the one thing we were talking about was the ARPA funding, right?
ARPA funds, you got 2 grants.
So I think we discussed it, but if you want to reiterate those 2 grants that we've submitted.
He's a genius getting money. He's not going to tell you that, but
We know.
he's a wizard.
We tease them all the time. And
Yeah. We did secure additional $1 million in ARPA funds for the Lakeshore Trail and an additional $600,000 for the South Marina to finish up those improvements with the parking lot this year. So good things are happening.
that's fantastic.
And then we're actually going after some more grants.
We are going after more UORG grants.
So we're doing some new applications for Utah Outdoor Recreation Grants. So we've gotten that grant many times in the past, and they love us because we deliver. I think more than any other, they've told us more than any other city, we are the ones that they know, if we get the money, we will give them, and quickly. So the Sunrise Meadows Bike Park was funded through a new URG grant. The boat ramps that we did on
We
the
have a lot
Jordan
of
River.
shelf-ready projects.
And those were delivered with a UROG grant. We have a UROG grant on the South Marina that obviously we're delivering on by building the jetties and stuff. And so this year we wanted to go after both the same ones. So they were normally small, 150,000, but this year they actually created a pool for a bigger one, 700,000.
750?
For regional projects. And what's more regional than our North Marina?
Yes.
So Lars is preparing 3 grants.
3 grants.
One, so the big one we're gonna go after is another 700,000 for the North Marina. That'll piggyback on, or aggregate on, I think, the 2 or 3 other grants we've already gotten for the North Marina. We're doing one for Heron Hills Park. So that's the one, we haven't talked about it much. The developer of Heron Hills dedicated that land.
That was the one that we were gonna do like a boardwalk maybe or something.
Right, so we're still waiting on them to build their $300,000 approximate improvements. But we know that $300,000 is only gonna get some rough grading, a gravel parking lot. So we know that it's gonna leave the city with a significant amount of improvements to finish that park. So we thought at least another 150,000 would at least maybe get us one more step closer to a finished park. And then the third one was Inlet Park.
For the parking
I
lot.
forget, remind me again, what was we were gonna apply for what?
We are going to apply to improve the parking lot and the restrooms
At the.
at Inlet Park. Yeah, so
current,
those
yeah.
are the 3.
Where
was
the
something
single soccer field is today, or,
Yeah, it's not gonna expand the facility per se, it's just gonna, remember we did the expansion parking years ago?
Yeah.
We put the Jersey barriers and gravel?
Yep.
So it would allow us to make that nicer and paved.
okay,
And then I think Rick and Heston talked about some needs where they'd like to see the existing restrooms maybe upgraded because they're kind of old and.
are there restrooms there?
On the
Yes.
Oh, there
south
are.
parking
They're on the
lot.
south end of the park.
Inherited those from the,
Yep, yep.
So with our record, it's possible we could get all 3 applications just because we have such a great reputation with them, but we'll see.
That'd be great.
Thank you.
Lars, do you need any additional information to get you going on your project?
Yeah, I don't have the plans for the future city hall and library yet, so I'll need those plans. Oh,
We know where they're at.
We need a placeholder. We'll put a placeholder there for you.
okay. So should I concept something in there?
We actually have some
some
concepts that we can share
footprints.
with you.
Okay, yeah, that's all I need. So from there I can run with it.
Yeah, he just needs a footprint.
Thank you. We're glad to have you on this project with us.
Yeah, it's been fun working with you all these
I
years.
love working with you guys. It's fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks,
Let's
Lars.
win some more awards on our parks.
Okay. We have the training, municipal land use conduct. Kevin.
Yeah, Mayor and Council and Planning Commission, we have on the agenda joint training. There's 2 parts of that. The first one, which is going to be the best, I promise, will be done by Jordan Collimore. And Jordan is actually here. He's with the Utah State Property Rights Ombudsman's Office. And he actually took the place of Brent Bateman. Brent has been here once or twice and conducted training, and Jordan was gracious enough to provide the training tonight, so we're looking forward to that. Kayla, if you can pull up the presentation, it's in the presentation folder. So, feel free to come up, Jordan, and introduce yourself, and we have our Planning Commission members sitting over here. I don't know if I guess they probably have good views, and they're over on this side of the room, I believe, so. Go ahead, Jordan. Yeah,
Kevin, would it be better if we?
okay, the other one, the PDF.
They have TVs. They can see. There's 7 of them though.
It could be better as far as questions. Jordan's presentation's kind of interactive, isn't it?
Yeah, and so as far as the slides go, I probably won't use all of them and we'll jump around, but.
Don't mind them to call an audible, get a couple planning up on the dais and then staff, you're welcome to migrate back.
Do you want to grab that chair over there?
That's a good idea.
Yes, but I don't, oh, you're talking about like, yeah, I don't know.
You can scoot down.
Also, but yeah, I'm Utah County Public Works through Salt Lake. No. Oh, there's also like the Bountiful. No. But yeah, anyway.
Let's sit down here. We can roll, why don't you roll, why don't you roll a chair up?
Good. Yeah, no, I've heard a lot of good things.
already one up there.
Anyway.
Oh, sorry.
Excuse me. Am I in the right place or should I go somewhere else?
You're good.
One more up here.
You can't see from our spot. And does this work if I? Oh, it does work, good. Okay. Ready to go? All right, well, so I'll start talking while everyone's shuffling around. Thanks for having me, number one. I worked with Kevin over the years. It's great to work with him and to be invited out to Saratoga Springs. I hope you guys have plenty of food and water in the building so that when we're snowed in, we can have a good party. But right, yeah. Oh, that'd be great, actually, yeah.
Okay. Are you doing a Chick-fil-A run?
Yeah. Chick-fil-A is great, right? Yeah, so my name is Jordan Cullimore. I have my information up there on the screen because first and foremost, we want you to know that we're a resource. So who pre-pandemic went to a presentation by Brent Bateman as the ombudsman? Anyone here? Okay. So when I find that out, I have to give the caveat. Brent hired me. I worked for Brent. He is funnier than me, but I am more intelligent than Brent. So there's the balance, right? I'm kidding. But yeah, it's good to be here. The Ombudsman's office, there's 3 attorneys in our office. It's me, Marcy Jones, and Rick Plen. And then we also now have a land use training coordinator who I brought, Rob Terry. And he's going to kind of be around to help coordinate training efforts throughout the state. So you'll probably hear from him and see more of him. But again, first and foremost, we like people to know that we're just a resource, right? So I put up my my phone number and my email and our website. We get good feedback about our website. It has good information about property rights issues. And then we just encourage people to give us a call. So if you have questions or want to talk about anything, please call. The primary things we do are land use and eminent domain, right? On the eminent domain side, when there's some sort of a need, a public use to take private property, the property owner can request that we get involved to help mediate the dispute, right? I have at the Riverton Library, which is where I live in Riverton, and Riverton Library, we're doing a neighborhood meeting tomorrow evening for a project that's happening in Harriman, right? So we help property owners, we help staff and local government understand what the roles, rights, responsibilities are on each side. So if ever an eminent domain issue comes up, feel free to reach out to us. And then on the land use side, the primary dispute resolution tool that we provide is the advisory opinion. So you can go on our website, you can look at the advisory opinions we've done in the past. We're nearing 300 that we've done in the history of the office. And it's intended to be a tool that parties can come and say, hey, we have this dispute over this legal issue. Can you give us a prediction about what a court would say? And then they have a pretty good reputation of being helpful in resolving disputes. So that's kind of what we do. Any initial questions about that? Okay. So now we'll get into the fun part, right? So this is kind of not working really well. Can you advance it? Thank you. Okay. So this is something I inherited from Brent, that we call this the Jeopardy board of common issues in land use that we deal with in our office and that we deal with in the state, right? So a few weeks ago, I was in Fairview. A week or two before that, I was in Beaver County with Milford and Minersville and Beaver. They deal with different things than what you guys are dealing with, right? We recognize that land use is inherently local. Fairview wasn't talking about a regional park, for instance, right? And Beaver was talking about different things. So we recognize that each community has the things that they deal with, and we want to kind of provide training and answer questions that will be useful to you guys, that you find to be interesting and want to learn about. Kevin sent me an email and indicated that some of the things you talked about wanting to know about are legislative and administrative decision-making, the pending ordinance rule. So, I mean, I can jump into those, or if you have questions, we can talk about those things. So should I just kind of start easing into it, and then as we go, I intend this not to be a lecture, but more of a discussion to the extent that it can, right? What's that? Okay. And those are, administrative, legislative decision-making, that is the best place to start, frankly, right? When you're talking about land use decision-making. So can you go to, I think it's just the next slide. Yes, okay. So here's a slide that we put up that kind of makes the distinction, right? So going back to civics class, right? Government makes different types of decisions. We make legislative decisions, which is you determine what the rules are, right? But you get to decide what the laws are. When you do that, you're legislating. You're policy making, essentially. But once the rules are in place, we're a nation of laws, right? And you got to follow those laws. And so when someone brings in a specific application for some sort of a development, you can see the different types of applications: subdivision permits, site plans, building permits, variances. Those things become administrative decision-making, right? And the standards and the rules that apply are very different depending on the given, right? So on the legislative side, you can see up there, we're talking about your general plan, your land use ordinances and development standards, your zone map, annexations, right? All of those, you can ask the big questions, right? What do we want our setbacks to look like? How big do we want our lots to be? Where do we want residential? Where do we want commercial? Where do we want industrial? You're asking those big questions, and frankly, you're listening to the public and their preferences and their opinions, right? You want to have a lot of meetings. You want to find out what people think. And as far as the decision you make, as long as we're attorneys, we look at it from a standpoint of what's legal, what's not legal. We try to help people make good decisions by making legal decisions, right? And in land use, when you're talking about legislative decision making, it's a good decision and it's an illegal it is a legal decision if it is reasonably debatable to be in the public interest, right? So, in other words, the courts defer heavily to the legislative body, the city council, in determining what kind of decisions they want to make from a legislative standpoint. So if you say, hey, we want residential to be over here, we want this development agreement to look like this, we want to have these this size of lot, as long as that decision is reasonably debatable to be in the public interest, it's a legal decision, right? And so really what you're doing is you're determining and finding out what the preferences are, right, of your community. And the Planning Commission, right, you guys are the technical advisory committee to the city council. And so, you're doing the same thing. You're gathering information, you're deciding what goes best where. You're looking at infrastructure, right? You're looking at funding sources and things like that, and you're deciding what's going to be the best choice. Once you've done that and everything's in place, then the discretion shifts a little bit, right? So now, when someone comes in and says, all right, I want to subdivide, and if there's questions or comments or otherwise, jump in, right? But when someone comes in with an application for a conditional use permit or a commercial site plan or a residential subdivision or a master plan development under a master planning zone, right? Now, at that point, you're looking to the code and you're making sure things comply, right? So if the public comes in at that point and says, hey, you know what, we don't want this here, unfortunately, you can't listen to that anymore, right? You don't get to consider preferences and opinions of the local community about what they want, because all that was made and done, or should have been done anyway, hopefully, right, at the policy-making stage, the legislative decision-making stage. So, you're taking off your legislative hat, you're putting on your administrative hat. State law only requires, it doesn't require any sort of a public body to be involved, frankly, in administrative decision-making. So you can delegate that completely to staff because, again, it's largely expected to be kind of a technical review, right, in a lot of ways. Now, when you get into conditional use permits and maybe some standards in your ordinances, sometimes there are discretionary decisions. But even those, right, you have to support them with evidence. You can't just support them with opinions, right? You have to support them with some sort of good evidence as to why you're making the decision you're making. And then otherwise, you just have to follow the rules, right? You have to follow the plain language of the ordinances. So in a nutshell and as an overview, that's kind of the distinction between administrative and legislative making. Do you guys have any specific questions or issues you want to talk about or bring up?
At one time, I've been on the Planning Commission for a few years.
Yeah.
And early on, it felt like during a legislative process, if an applicant brings up some kind of like an exception that they're requesting, we tried to be pretty consistent in either agreeing to or not agreeing to recommend approval or, whatever the case may be. But nowadays, I feel like being consistent is not as important because we're so much more complicated and we're doing, bigger things. Like you said, we were worried about regional parks, whereas other cities don't. And we're at that stage now where, we want to put overlays and things where we control more of how the city is going to appear in the future. And it impacts owners, property owners and developers and such in different ways because they're, down a certain path. They're already further down the process than others. And so it's just different impacts. So I'm not so much concerned about consistency as I am about the individual or the particular specific request. And I'm wondering, would that be an issue? Because, would the public perceive that as favoritism or, or we should be, or should we listen more to the specific case because we are more complicated than before, where we could just simply say, let's just be consistent. It's always no or always yes, as long as we find some kind of a grounding in the land use.
Yeah. So just for clarification, is this a scenario in which you're talking about maybe like a development agreement, a master plan development that you're creating a new plan for and a new zone for?
Not necessarily, because the Planning Commission doesn't necessarily see that part of it, but when just applications where certain exceptions are requested. Yeah, and we used to try to apply it pretty consistently because we wanted to seem like we're being fair as opposed to, just whatever, individual choice. But now I'm thinking that, no, I don't care so much about consistency because it is more complicated and we should just consider the case before us or the application before us. Again, in your experience, would that be perceived as bias or would that be perceived as, or if we don't do that, that we're not really taking into consideration the individual applicant's case?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And I mean, zoning and planning, it has become over the years more and more specialized, right? The best response I can give, and then this question does come up a lot, right? The word that everyone always uses is precedent, right? Are we setting a precedent and then are we bound by that precedent moving forward? And again, as long as you're following the rules and working within the criteria set by state law, there isn't, and your local ordinance, there isn't a scenario where you bind yourself to a precedent, right? And we're talking generally, right? Will the public perceive it as unfair or inequitable? Most certainly. From a legal standpoint, does that get you in hot water? Probably not, right? And is it smarter to take it on a case-by-case basis and look at the specific impacts of the development and address those specific impacts accordingly? The law says absolutely, right? So yeah, it's kind of a balancing game, and that's kind of the part of the presentation where I say thank you for your service, right? Because often you are having to deal with the public, and the public is good, right? I mean, you guys are here to serve the public. So when I say you have to deal with the public, you have to deal with their perceptions and their, proclivities and their concerns. Sometimes, again, when you're making legislative decisions, that's part of the reason I ask, right? Like if it's a master plan development and you're doing a development agreement that's going to impose completely new requirements, then yeah, maybe you listen to the public's concerns and maybe you try to have meetings where the developer and the property and the public can get together and try to find a solution, right? If you're on the administrative decision-making side, a lot of times you're unfortunately just going to have to let the public know, sorry, we can't consider what your concerns are. And, just because we did something in the past doesn't mean that that's the right decision for today, necessarily. Does that help?
So if I could offer if I could offer just one thing, and you wouldn't know about this, but we have what's called the planned community zone.
Okay.
Which a lot of the city is, we have thousands of acres that's in the planned community zone.
Okay.
And that's both legislative and administrative at different points, right? When we have a community plan and when you're creating a community plan, that's legislative. And you're making recommendations to the council, that's legislative. When they bring in their village plan, because this planned community zone, they get to seek changes to perhaps our design standards or what, there are certain things that they can request, which are still legislative at that design process. And it's not until you formally adopt the village plan that then becomes, after that, it's now an administrative decision, because you're still creating code, you're still forming that. And so some of Ken's questions, our mixed-use zone is like that. Or I should say our mixed residential zone is like that, because they still have some ability from the legislative decision-making to give them exceptions to how they're going to lay out their community. And so at some point, it does become an administrative decision, but on some of those higher level things, it's still legislative. And so, yes, it would be appropriate for those comments to influence your decision-making when it's the legislative type items. Once we get down past those decisions being made, unless they're requesting an amendment to their village plan, which kicks it back up into legislative discretionary decision-making, then it's going to largely stay administrative at that point. So it's complex because we've given kind of this pick-your-own-adventure zoning here in Saratoga in an effort to try and work with the development community. Unfortunately, it's created a lot of those complexities that, we have a very dynamic system where people have the ability to request those amendments to our code or adjustments to our code specific to their village plan, which for your definition is master planning, these communities. So it's kind of complex, and your question, Ken, is great. We have so many of those specialty zones that lets them have that change. It then falls back into the legislative world until we get to that administrative phase.
Yeah, and that's kind of why I was asking the questions I was. And you have to be careful, especially in larger communities like Saratoga, right? There's a lot of complex and very sophisticated tools that we use. And the reality is that the line between legislative and administrative can significantly blur. I mean, the courts most recently, in a lot of their opinions, in my opinion, they've taken a "we'll know it when we see it" approach to a lot of the different tools out there, right? As far as whether it's legislative or administrative. And again, I mean, these things are litigated about whether or not some of these tools are in fact legislative or administrative. So really in these communities where you do have these complex tools, it's really important, right, decision makers, that you lean on staff and their counsel and guidance about, okay, this item is legislative, this item is administrative. Because again, if you're, frankly, the courts have even said, hey, even if your code calls something out as administrative, you're considering broad and competing policy considerations, and then you're making new rules that apply. They've said, nope, sorry, that's legislative, right? The reason it makes such a big difference from a legal standpoint is because, well, most recently, is because legislative decisions are referable to the people. You can file referendums for legislative decisions. You cannot for an administrative decision, right? And so that's why these discussions come up, and why it's important that you try to make the right decision. You don't expose yourself to liabilities or to long and drawn out processes, drive costs up for everyone, right? But yeah, most of the time, 90% of the time, it's pretty clear. And just know that if you're making a legislative decision, you can consider public input, you can think about policy considerations and opinions and preferences. But if you're making administrative decisions, you're following the law and you're supporting it with evidence, right?
So can I ask for just clarification for here in Saratoga Springs? Especially after the change that was made, was requested by council not long ago. Correct me if I'm wrong, the planning commission is strictly, at this point, strictly administrative. Is that correct?
As far as,
Yeah.
yeah, and I think I can answer that maybe a little bit better. So you never act as a legislative body, because you're an appointed body, but you do make recommendations on legislative decisions to the city council. So in that capacity, that's when you consider these broad policy considerations with your recommendation on a legislative decision. But you're never actually the legislative body, of course.
Right, so.
But you are, as far as you making a decision, you're the final deciding body. You are acting strictly in an administrative capacity when you are the final decision
Code
maker.
changes, we're making recommendations.
Right.
We have applicants that
Right.
come in and they're requesting code changes in special circumstances, or, forget the code changes, but they're they're proposing a project. We're looking at the code and saying,
here's the code, you look at the project and say, does this project, what they want to do, comply with the code? And so the answer is yes, it is, or no, it's not. And that's essentially the planning commission's role, correct?
Well, so that's one of their roles, but honestly, so what Kevin described as, you make recommendations to the city council on legislative decisions. That's in state code, right? So with land use decisions, that's one of the few areas where before the city council makes, they have to get a recommendation from the planning commission, right? The idea being that, hey, land use can be a very technical exercise, right? And you got to look at a lot of different things, and you got to look at services, and you got to look at infrastructure, you got to, get a lot of public input. So really, planning commission, it should be your role to come up with good plans, right? It's in the name, planning commission, right? And to give some good advice to the city council. But when you are designated as the land use authority, so that's the term that the state law uses for whoever is making the administrative decision, right? When you are designated as a land use authority, which again, for kind of those things up there we talked about, right? Subdivisions and conditional use permits and things like that. So if you are making the final decision, then yes, most certainly all you're doing is looking at the rules and making sure they comply, considering staff reports, right, that your planners have submitted saying this complies, this needs to change, those types of things. It's a very technical inquiry for sure. Does that help? Yeah.
And just so Jordan isn't aware of this, but we don't have conditional use permits in our city anymore.
Wow.
So it's either permitted
Guys are
or prohibited.
advanced.
No conditional uses.
Okay.
But again, to that point, sometimes you'll get a village plan where they're saying, hey, we want to amend our village plan. Well, you're back in the legislative role because you're making a recommendation to them as to whether they should make that change to that.
And then just a follow-up question around the same. So the pending legislation at the state takes, I don't know what the right analogy is, but takes at least one more bite from that apple away from the planning commission, puts it back into the hands of the staff. Expedited processing, that's what's being proposed.
That's what's being proposed, yeah. And frankly, to what Jordan was saying just a minute ago, there's actually a bill up at the legislature that would say if 3/4 of the council approve a land use decision, legislative land use decision, that it becomes non-referable by the public, which again, that's contrary to what we probably as a council, they've expressed to us their desires, because with the Krejci Saratoga case several years ago, they overturned a council decision. The Supreme Court weighed in heavy on that. And I don't think the council's policy direction to us as staff would be, hey, go support legislation that takes away the referendum of citizens. We got overturned, but we still feel that it's the imperative right of the citizens to be able to challenge those land use decisions where the legislature is saying, no, let's take that appeals right away from the citizenry, from the referendum. So yes, there's two sides to that coin. It is process, it is lengthy, but just because a legislative body has might does not mean it's right. Sorry, just a foreshadowing for where we stand as a community on that.
I had forgotten that Crikey happened. Good job.
Ask him, he's the attorney.
So what's being, that ability to offer the referendum right in the public, is it progressive or is it reactive or retroactive? Meaning because there was, action taken here in the city around some of that, some of those things, and then
Going forward.
they can't go back and they can't grandfather.
It's almost always proactive or prospective, as opposed to retroactive for sure.
But they'll probably lose that on a court challenge anyway, so. The state has the referendum language built into the Constitution, if I remember correctly. So that's not built into the Constitution. Probably, but we'll let these guys sort that one out.
Maybe Jordan can help answer this question, and I think this is the hardest one that I've found for administrative bodies to fully understand, and that is, you mentioned that there's some discretion in an administrative decision. And it's not always just yes or no. Like, for instance, we sometimes allow reductions in front yard setbacks, and we have a number of factors that the Planning Commission and the council decide and look at in making that decision. So talk about that a little bit, discretion in an administrative decision.
Yeah, good question. So that's when you get into substantial evidence, right? And yeah, with administrative decisions, again, sometimes it's just looking at the rules and following the rules, but the rules can also provide criteria and standards, right, that the decision maker can follow to allow for adjustments or exceptions and things like that, right? To your point, right, you talked about consistency. What the law requires is that you're not arbitrary and capricious, right? And in the administrative decision-making world, you're not arbitrary and capricious if you're supporting your decision-making with evidence. So number one, your ordinances should have standards, right? If you have any provisions in your ordinance that say you can make this exception at the sole discretion of ... I would highly recommend getting those out. Because that's probably going to lead to arbitrary and to capricious decision-making, right? Just at the sole discretion of so-and-so, right? So there has to be some sort of criteria, right? If you're going to reduce a front yard setback, it needs to, and then you list it out, right? And there needs to be this type of frontage and maybe this type of traffic and those types of things. And then you have to support your decision to grant the exception or the exercise of the discretion with evidence, whether it's parking studies, geological studies, right? Surveys, different things like that. You want to have some good evidence that is objective, relevant, and factual, right, to support the decision you make, as opposed to just, well, I think this is best. Does that make sense? Any other questions about that one? So just remember, you have to, and then it has to be in the record. So there actually was just a recent case that came down a day or two ago that reiterated this point that the courts have been making over the past few years, that when you make an administrative decision, it's like math class, guys. You got to show your work. You got to make findings, and you got to provide the reasons you made the decisions you made in writing. So, and
those findings have to be part of your actual motion, not just discussion. So that happens a lot where you're talking about something but you don't put that in your motion. Well, if it doesn't make it in your motion, that's not going to be part of the official evidence in the record.
And I would maybe you guys do stuff like this, but a really good practice to ensure that happens is have some sort of a record of decision that is distributed to all parties after the decision, right? And you list out and say, okay, here was what was approved, and these were the conditions, or these were the exceptions granted, or the things that were approved. It's a really good practice and helps make sure you're on the up and up with those kinds of things. So, good questions. Anything else about that, or should we move on to pending ordinance? And I know I don't want to take up too much time, so give me the axe when we're done. But yeah, the cane, right? Well, so yeah, if you want to, I did make some slides. If you want to go down, keep going down to where it says vested rights. We already talked about all this. Do vested rights. Okay, so I was looking up vested rights in a planning website. I had that graphic, and that's a sense of humor. So vested rights. Okay, so if we're going to talk about the pending ordinance rule, we first have to talk about vested rights. Okay, and you can see some quotes up there. So these quotes are from kind of the seminal case in vested rights in land use in Utah, Western Land Equities versus Logan. A property owner should be able to plan for developing his property in a manner permitted by existing zoning regulations with some degree of assurance. The basic rules will not be changed midstream, and it is incumbent upon the city to act in good faith and not to reject an application because the application itself triggers zoning reconsiderations that result in a substitution of the judgment of current city officials for that of their predecessors. So this goes hand in hand with administrative decision, right? When someone brings in an application to simply have the rules applied to their development proposal, what the vested rights doctrine says is when someone submits an application, a complete application, right? So we can get into that if you'd like, but it's basically an application that allows the local government to begin reviewing the application, right? It doesn't have to comply substantively in every form, in every case, right? But it has to be, the law says, in a form that complies with local ordinance. So hopefully you have something in your ordinance that says, hey, for this type of application, you need to submit all of these documents, a preliminary plat, all these different types of studies, right? And if someone submits what's required under the code and then pays the applicable fee, then their right to have their application reviewed under the ordinances that exist at that time vest, right? They get a vested right. There are exceptions to the vested right rule, right? And it's interesting because Utah, we're considered an early vesting state, right? So the fact that someone can come in and submit an application that's complete and pay a fee and know that the rules are not going to be pulled out from underneath them or changed midstream, that's early vesting, right? In a lot of states, you have to have vertical improvements coming out of the ground and a significant investment before the law says you can't change the rules. And frankly, it leads to a lot of economic waste, right? And a lot of problems in the community, litigation and those types of things that increase the cost. In this Western Land Equities case, I was just reviewing it this morning, and this was 1980, and they talked about some of these late vesting states because of affordability issues, right, run into a lot of problems. So it's becoming increasingly important in Utah, right, that we have efficient and streamlined processes to the extent possible, right? And I think that's some of the reasoning behind some of the legislation you're seeing this year, right? That's standardizing processes like that. Really, what it comes down to is each community needs to make sure that the process works for people, right? And if you're doing that, then you're doing the things you need to do. But yeah, so that's the vested rights rule. The pending ordinance rule is an exception to vested rights, okay? There's two exceptions. And if you want to scroll to the next one, I think I go one more. Okay, so here's the exceptions to the vested right rule, vested rights. So if someone brings in an application, pays the fee, then they're vested. There are two scenarios where there's an exception. One is there's a compelling countervailing public interest that would be jeopardized. The example we always use is someone gets approval, and then they're getting all their ducks in a row to go start building a house under a building permit, and the next day the house next door starts sliding down the hill, right? There's a significant geological issue in the area, right? That is a compelling countervailing public interest that would be jeopardized if you let this application move forward under the existing rules, right? So it's got to be really serious stuff if we're talking about compelling countervailing public interest. The other one, though, is pretty simple, and that's the pending ordinance rule. So I saw that you guys did one of those before I came, right? Good job. But yeah, essentially what that says is if you formally initiated procedures to amend your ordinance according to the local ordinance, right? So your local ordinance defines how you create a pending ordinance or how you make the ordinance pending. Then any application that comes in after that pending ordinance is formally initiated, for 180 days, they're put on notice, right? That, hey, something might change, right? And if it does change within that 180 days and we enact an ordinance, then you're going to be subject to that, right? So that's just something to keep in mind and be aware of. But if if your ordinance is pending the day after an application is submitted, that application gets in, right? And they vest and they're entitled to be reviewed under the ordinance at that time, so.
Just to clarify, number two, they're vested as soon as number one, regardless of when they put their application, that can be, they're not vested if it is a countervailing public interest.
Right, and so again, we're talking about some due process rights potentially that may be suspended here. So you have to make, and what's not on there is you have to make a formal finding on the record, right? So that there is a compelling countervailing public interest. And again, you're going to want to support it with evidence. So, yep. So, well, yeah, get Kevin involved if you're gonna do that, right? If you're gonna deny an application based upon the justification of a compelling countervailing public interest, just make sure you're following all the requirements. That standard also applies to what we call temporary land use regulations, where, again, you can put a temporary moratorium. People often refer to it as a moratorium. But if you make a finding of a compelling countervailing public interest, then you can, again, suspend certain due process rights. You don't have to have certain hearings, and you can put an ordinance in place that says we're not going to allow development here.
Like when we lost sewer capacity, we were able to stop development because there was no way, and you can't have sewage going nowhere.
That sounds like a good reason, yeah. See, but some of the places, some of the reasons this has been used, and admittedly, this is for rural communities, things like that, but they'll say, hey, we're not sure we like multifamily development. Not a good reason, frankly, right? But yes, if you have some sort of a public health emergency or something like that, that's when this compelling countervailing public interest issue comes in place, and you can do things that it kind of swings away from private property rights, frankly, right?
Yeah,
In
and
favor of the public interest.
We could probably spend 1 or 2 hours on that alone. And also remember, that doesn't always give you a free pass. You might have to still pay, just compensation to the property owner.
Yep, that's a good point.
Anyway, go ahead.
For sure. Okay, well, yeah, so that's the gist of the pending ordinance rule and how it interacts with the vested rights doctrine. Any questions there? Okay, so I mean, if you want to go back to the second slide, I don't know how much more time we have. So yeah, you can either tell me to sit down and say thanks, or we can talk about anything else on here.
And you didn't really talk much about our ordinance. Could you
Oh.
just
I
go over
think
that?
that's the last slide. I don't
know how far you have to drive, but it is getting that out.
I'm in Riverton, but
It is getting pretty bad.
is it?
One thing the council did ask us to do is to do a training on our current ordinance. So
So if you go to the last slide.
speak briefly on that, that would.
Yeah. Yeah, and I really, honestly, the primary thing I have to say for that, right, is, oh, not the last one. Go up 1, 2, oh, no, it wasn't the last slide. Keep going. Right, keep going. Thank you. Right there. Okay. So there's your definition, right, of a pending ordinance. A city code, zoning map, or general plan amendment has been reviewed by the Planning Commission in an open and public meeting and received a positive recommendation to the City Council, or has been first reviewed by the City Council and has been included or attached to a resolution council's intent to initiate proceedings to amend. So I think B was what you just did today. Is that right? Is that accurate to say? So now that that's in place, right, anyone who brings in an application tomorrow or in the next 180 days, they're on notice that, hey, we're looking at this issue, this parking issue, right? And so if your application is going to rely on that, on the current parking requirements, you need to wait, right? And you can do that. You can make them wait because you have a pending ordinance in place.
So it's not the day after, right? You have to like record it. We were told that you couldn't do the day after. I was told that last time. You didn't count. You were saying, Kevin, that you have to wait till the recording, and I think it was 3 days.
Well, that's because we were going the planning commission route, and the planning commission had not made a positive recommendation on that particular one. I think that's what you're referring to, but I think what you're talking about is a separate issue about when an ordinance takes effect. And that's when an ordinance takes effect when it's published by the city recorder.
Like, that's something we voted on tonight, that officially doesn't take place until city posts it tomorrow.
Right, so for instance, the ordinance that approved the amended impact fee, that's not effective tonight. It'll be effective tomorrow when Cindy actually publishes a short summary on the public notice website. That's the effective date of the ordinance.
Well,
Is that what you're referring to?
And on impact fees, it doesn't take place for, 120 days or
Oh, yeah, that's a
90
great
days
point.
in addition. So again, there's other restrictions.
Not a great example, but yes.
But at least it has to, yeah, it would have to be published first for the ordinance to be effective. Mark's right about
What is the advantage
impact fees.
of going A versus just doing B?
That's my
And the
question.
ordinance
Why would
was all
you
about
ever go to-
speed.
Why would you ever go to A?
Well, and it isn't, the whole purpose of it's speed. It doesn't make sense.
Well, I
It doesn't
think
make any sense to me, like, you would never choose A, right?
this isn't necessarily about getting something in as quick as possible. It's about a process where you're changing your ordinance. Now, all future applications have to comply with the legislation that's been initiated. So that's the process. It's not necessarily with the planning commission, but yeah, you're correct. That's a slower process than it would be if it goes through the council route through
I know
resolution.
you're saying it's not about speed or pending ordinances. We figured something out that's a big mistake and a big problem within our code. We need to try and get it fixed quickly. We want to give the public notice so that they're not, to your point, that they're not
feeling like they're taken advantage of, so we're giving them as quick a notice as possible. So to your point, B, this, I think it should be a standard process. B should almost always be the approach. If we're making, because we make changes to ordinances all the time, I mean, we're cleaning up our code all the time, and we don't do pending ordinance definition through the planning commission. That's just, to me, A is the normal process. Planning commission reviews the changes, they give us the recommendations, that's just the normal recommendation. Why do we even have that? And is it required by state code to have an A in a pending ordinance?
So I'm not the drafter, right? If I had to speculate, it looks like one is designed for when the planning commission identifies the issue, and the other is for when the city council has identified the issue. And admittedly, you know, so all that state law says is that you formally initiated procedures to amend your ordinance in accordance with local ordinance, right? So a lot of, like, you guys are ahead of the game in that you actually have a definition in your code. Most communities do not, and we've done advisory opinions on that, right?
So we have a big problem, and the last one that really blew up and it really ticked me off, and probably the most frustrating thing in 13 years that I dealt with, is the planning commission didn't bring that forward, the city council did. So I like his recommendation in the future, if the city council is bringing forth a concern, we go B, planning commission. I'd love it if you guys see something there's a problem. We have people who've done that for us in the past, like city planning commissioners, come forward and say, hey, did you guys know that this is conflicting another part of the code? I think you should fix that. And that was really helpful, and we've had it over the years. So I think that.
I think in most cases,
This-
because it's gonna be the staff, at least in the past, the staff is gonna, it needs to be fixed, they bring it to this. to the
Yeah.
Planning commission, and then it goes to the city council.
Well, I think
So
the last one that just
A
happened was
makes
the city
sense in
council
some
had an
cases.
issue.
Legislation is initiated either under our ordinance, either through the resolution by the council or through the planning commission. So that we don't need to call the code amendment that the planning commission is considering. We don't call that, we're not like labeling that a pending ordinance. That's just simply code amendment. You hold a public hearing, you have a positive recommendation. Now it's a pending ordinance. So future applications that come in, they're subject to that change. So that's the normal process that we go through. But
Well, the
if
pending
there's
ordinance,
if it's time sensitive,
The pending ordinance, this is a pending ordinance. If it is starting with the planning commission, I'm completely supportive of that. And they need to send a positive recommendation. If you don't vote equally, like 4 of the 7, then it shouldn't go through. This is pending ordinance. If there's ever a pending ordinance that's coming from staff or from council, that should come B. That's just my personal opinion.
well,
One of 5.
what I'm saying they both are. So if you're looking at the interests that you're dealing with, and it's more a time-sensitive matter, then yes, it should go the council route. If it's just simply going through the normal process of amending the code, as soon as it's with the planning commission, it's not it's a code change that's being considered by the planning commission.
Well, and if I could,
Well, so when you do an ordinance change, then the pending rule comes into play potentially for subsequent applications, right?
I think we're spinning circles here. I'm just saying, if the staff or the council sees that there's an issue, we go past B. If the planning commission for pending ordinance, if the planning commission sees something, we go to plan A. If it's an ordinance change, we go to plan A, because it's not really pending, it's a quasi-pending ordinance, because as soon as it starts, the regular ordinance change, then the planning commission is.
so
That's just my personal opinion. You made the comment that, and I agree with you, it's like, and then we got to, why would you not go B?
So if I could, I can use an
We
example.
would not have the problem we had a month ago if we would have done this way.
So the example I would give is tonight, I'd mentioned, hey, we're going to bring back the parking code. That's something the council asked us to do. We're going to do some research and we're going to take something back to the planning commission that looks at other elements of the parking code. It's not something that's pressing. As soon as they take action on it, it will have the same effect because of planning commission. But it's not something that's necessarily pressing. And so to kind of presuppose what that language should be, we're going to let it come organically through the planning commission process. And so there's those two separate venues that we'll be bringing it through as is most appropriate. And from a sensitivity standpoint, again, we don't know if there's going to be a parking issue with them organically amending the parking code to what we've discussed in the past. We just know that it's going to come forward. That may not capture that if that's not in place quick enough. But again, we don't see something that has to take place right now.
And I don't want to say anything out of place, right? I mean, listen to your staff, consider amongst yourselves, right? But you really can decide when you formally initiate procedures to amend your ordinance through your code, right? For communities that don't have anything in place, kind of what we've looked at based on the case law, we've said, hey, if you have put an item on an agenda and you've published notice appropriately for that agenda item, then most communities would probably agree, and the courts would probably agree, that that's the earliest that you have formally initiated procedures to amend your ordinance, right? So now again, you have a rule in your ordinance, right? So you need to follow that. But if you did want something that was clearer and more straightforward, right, then you could do that in your code to make it so there's only one process if it is causing issues in your community, right?
Well, and I appreciate that. It's important to clarify that that's an advisory opinion that's been issued. No Utah court has decided that issue.
No, sorry, I don't mean to say anything.
As far as, and I know, I just want to clarify that advisory opinion is not law, but.
No, not at all.
We have a process that we have followed when it's been time sensitive, and that's going through the council and adopting that change through resolution.
And I think the point that's being made with that is that what Western Land Equities was very clear to say is that there is the court basically called it a duty of good faith, right? So there are a lot of communities where, and I'm not saying this is the case here, but the issue that we see and that typically you run into with a pending ordinance is sometimes a developer or property owner will come in, and maybe you're in, I don't know if you guys do concept reviews or not, right? And but they'll come in and they'll say, hey, we have this idea, right? And then the local government will use that as an opportunity to turn around and quickly put a pending ordinance in place, right? So they're kind of providing a forum where people can come in and share their ideas with the intent of using that forum so that they can vet before the idea comes in, before the formal application comes in, right? They can vet whether or not they like it, and then they can turn around and formally initiate procedures to amend their ordinance so that now there's this pending ordinance. And the court is very clear to say that, hey, that's probably bad faith, right? And if you're doing that, you're providing a process that doesn't work, right? That isn't going to consider the higher principles of due process and property rights and those types of things. So again, you need to make sure that you follow the definitions that are in your ordinance. At the same time, if you feel like things aren't working well, then maybe you consider changing some of your definitions, right? And you can work through that process and decide together what you think the best process would be for that kind of stuff, if that's helpful. Good discussions. Any other questions? Comments?
There's a comment that was made about the planning commission bringing forth possible, conflicts in the code or something. The planning commission wouldn't be able to do anything unless there's public notice first anyway.
Right.
Right, so clearly, if there's an emergency of some sort, clearly it would have to be the city council to initiate that, because the planning commission is required to give a positive recommendation, which requires that the notice, public notice, and hearing and so forth, and that certainly is.
Yeah, so if it's time sensitive, we'd go the council route. And like I mentioned, we initiate litigation or legislation when the planning commission gives a positive recommendation or the council passes a resolution. We don't bring a code to you and say, this is a pending ordinance. It automatically happens. So at that point, applications that come in after your positive recommendation, assuming the council approves it and adopts it, they have to comply with the pending legislation. And then in this case, the parking code amendments that got approved through resolution tonight, future applications have to comply with the parking regulations that were as part of that resolution, assuming that those are ultimately adopted. And so it's not something where we wave a wand, say it's a pending ordinance, it automatically happens.
Good point. Yep. Good discussion. Okay, well, any other things you want to talk about in land use training this evening? Okay, well, thanks for having me, everyone.
Just as a quick heads up, the storm is picking up. I had to mute my ring here a minute ago because we're starting to see quite a bit of snowfall on the south end of the city. So we'll be brief with this portion of the, get you on your way.
Yeah, like I mentioned, the email we sent out today, this is, let's see, let's get this on really quick. Okay, so the Planning Commission was recently, I think in October, they received this, basically the same training. This is the training that we provide each year to the Planning Commission and the council and other public bodies. We sent out the PowerPoint presentation so you could review the slides before the meeting. Basically goes over the Open and Public Meetings Act, discusses the definition of a public body, definitions for what meetings consist of, and all the requirements that you need to go through to be compliant with the law. So first of all, any questions on what I sent out? Because for many of you, most of our council members have been here for many, many years, and so they know it like the back of their hand. Any questions from any of the planning commissioners or council members on the
I don't really
actual
have a question.
PowerPoint?
I just have a comment, and I just want you to clarify. Social media has definitely changed the way things go, and one of the things that I've been adamant about is not commenting on social media, because if 3 council members of 5 or 4 of the 7, is that considered a quorum if they're on there debating a topic, the 3 different council members on a social media site? What's the law on that?
So the law would basically, you'd have to go to the definition section of what a meeting is. And so if you go to that first, okay, no, actually it's the 3rd slide. Kayla, can you open that? Oh, okay, I've got this. So this is what it is. It's a convening of a public body, the quorum present, includes a workshop or executive session. So we would go through this whole thing in determining whether that is. That you've convened for the purpose of discussing, receiving comments from the public, or acting on a matter over which the public body has jurisdiction or advisory power. A meeting can be in person, electronic, or hybrid. So that's the basic definition of a meeting.
Technically it could, but it's not city-initiated electronic. This is Saratoga Link or whatever, and then you start getting, because we've been pretty good, because a lot of us, like me, I mean, Chris will be on there, and I never comment because I just think it creates a firestorm. It's just a nightmare. But I've seen other cities where 3 or 4 of the council members will get on there and they start talking about the situation. South Jordan has this problem. I'm just curious.
Yeah. So, okay. A meeting is not.
Yeah, I mean, I think but even it could be a future type of decision, a road issue, or even transportation issue, and like where your opinion is on how you should spend funding to expand roads. I think that can be a real problem. We haven't had the problem because we don't all get on there together and do it, but
Yeah.
I'm just curious, if 3 of us were on there doing that, would we be breaking the rule?
I think there needs to be, so there has to be a distinction between making a decision and maybe expressing your opinion as a council member.
Okay, so it's not too bad then, so that's not against.
So it would just depend on the circumstances, but
So it's not a Class B.
the facts that you set up for me would say that that's not a public meeting.
Okay.
And also it's helpful to also read the definition for what is not a meeting. And a meeting does not include a chance meeting or a social meeting. So that might cover your situation there. And a meeting does not include a meeting of a public body with both legislative and executive responsibility. That would be that our city council, you have both executive and legislative responsibility. Some of those, many of those have been delegated to the city manager, of course. But that's those meetings where no public funds are appropriated and the meeting is solely for administrative, operational matters, where no formal action is required, or the matter would not come before the public body.
Okay, so we're okay. Thank you.
Yeah, so.
Include ex parte?
But if the item is going to come to a public body, it could trigger that. And so it's a very difficult line.
Yeah, you got to be really careful with that, of course, because if you did get together and you were discussing a public matter and making decisions about committing public funds, even though it was not noticed, that would be a public meeting, you'd be in violation of it, so.
Or especially if it's going to come to a public body. I mean, if this is pre-scheduled, coordinating the outcome, then that certainly would, violate an element of that.
So Ken mentioned,
So I remember.
Ken mentioned a separate but kind of related matter, and that's ex parte communication. And, well, thank you, I appreciate that. I won't give you advice on much of that because it's a judgment call. You got to use your best judgment. But I will say that obviously erring on the side of caution is always the best. But Ken mentioned a separate, but it's kind of related, ex parte communication. We could ask Jordan about that. That's more related to land use law. And of course, the Planning Commission, that's all you look at is land use. You're making land use decisions. But ex parte communication refers to the concept of when you're having discussions with individuals, residents, developers outside the context of a public meeting. You got to be a little careful on that. Legislative matters, you can have as many ex parte communications as you want. When it comes to administrative, where you're applying the law, not making the law, you should be keeping those discussions to the public meeting to respect due process rights of the property owner. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a great comment, because developers and the history of the city, the developers have complained about that more than anything. Yeah, I remember in one of the training sessions with the ombudsman, that he emphasized caution when it came to ex parte communication. So I was just wondering how it fit with this.
But it's tough because you're going to get stopped in the grocery store and asked a question about, well, here's the example. You're going to get stopped by a resident in the grocery store or Walmart or wherever, Costco, and they're going to ask you a question about an application that's on the Planning Commission or the council's agenda. And that's going to be tough. If that happens, I would keep the conversation brief and then in a public meeting disclose that to the developer that you've had people asking you that. And we're actually really good at that. I've noticed in the council meetings, we share the emails that have been emailed, people that have emailed the council. So in the Planning Commission meetings, I would recommend that you do the same thing. So that's important. It needs to be part of this public discourse that the actual property owner that's going to be affected the most is part of that discussion. Okay, so any other questions on the main slides? Okay, two bills to look at and be aware of. We talked about one of them already, about the actual public comment portion of a meeting. We already do that. It's actually not required for the Planning Commission under this bill. It'll be an adjustment for like the library board. But one thing that the proposed bill also requires is that you have to adopt a resolution or ordinance allowing public comment during the public meetings. And as I looked at our code and your bylaws, we don't currently have that. We have a discussion about public hearings, but not public comment. And I did that intentionally because sometimes, legally, we weren't required to have a public comment portion. The council always wanted to have it. And now it's forced on us, so we have to have it in our bylaws or ordinances. So should this bill pass, that's what we'll do. And the second one is not a huge deal. It's just it's an additional reason to have a closed session. This would allow you to have a closed session to discuss the consideration of a loan application if disclosure would disclose either non-public personal financial information or a non-public trade secret or financial information, if disclosure would reasonably be expected to result in unfair competitive injury to the person submitting the info. So I don't know that we've ever had that situation come up here, but should we have a situation like that, you can have a closed session. Yeah, I don't know what the issue was there, but that's an interesting bill. And should that pass, that'll give you one more reason to have a closed session. So any other questions about Open and Public Meetings Act? Okay, thank you.
We just need a closed session briefly this evening, so.
Thank you. Good night. And this is your email, John. We're gonna have lots of feedback opportunities.